In 1985, a 30-year-old with zero banking experience sat down at a boardroom table in Denver and started approving loans. He'd never run a bank. He didn't need to. His last name did the work for him. The newest director of Silverado Savings and Loan wasn't just anybody. He was the son of the sitting vice president of the United States. 3 years later, Silverado was gone. Taxpayers were on the hook for over $1 billion. And the president's son? He paid $50,000 of it and never spent a single night in jail. Rewind to the early 80s. Denver was riding an oil boom and money was pouring into real estate. Silverado Banking, Savings and Loan had started out as a sleepy local thrift. Nothing special. The kind of place that took deposits and wrote conservative home mortgages. Nothing riskier than that. But Washington had just deregulated the savings and loan industry, tearing down the old rules and letting thrifts gamble on commercial real estate, raw land, and high-risk loans they'd never been allowed to touch before. Silverado's leadership saw the opening and went all in, chasing growth with loans that looked fantastic on paper, right up until they didn't. By 1985, Silverado needed something money couldn't buy on its own: credibility. It found that in Neil Bush, son of Vice President George H.W. Bush. Neil was 30 years old, ran a small oil and gas company called J&B Exploration, and had exactly zero background in banking. None of that mattered. His name alone made Silverado look safer, more connected, more legitimate, and he joined the board. Quick side note before we keep going. If you like this kind of deep dive breakdown, I put the actual scripts and research templates I use to build these up on Gumroad, links in the description. Okay, back to Denver. Almost immediately, the line between Neil Bush's personal business and the bank's money started to blur. Here's where it gets messy. A Denver developer named Kenneth Good handed Neil Bush $100,000 as an unsecured personal loan, no collateral, no real obligation to ever pay it back. Around the same time, Bush sat in the room and voted to approve a $900,000 line of credit for Good's company. He never told his fellow directors about the money he'd personally received from the same man he was voting to fund. Investigators later called it about as clean a conflict of interest as they'd ever seen on paper. Good would go on to default on $32 million in loans from Silverado, and $3 million of that default traced directly back into Bush's own oil company. It didn't stop there. Bush also approved a loan package worth over $100 million to another investor in his own company, a man named Bill Walters. Walters defaulted too, on all of it. Behind the scenes, Silverado was quietly bleeding money into deals connected to its own director's personal business, with almost no one outside the building aware of how deep the hole had gotten. Board meetings moved fast, big loan packages got waved through with little debate, and the people who might have asked hard questions mostly didn't. Regulators would later conclude the board had approved loans and investments without anything close to the oversight a bank that size actually needed. By the summer of 1988, the cracks had become a canyon. Days after the Republican National Convention, Neil Bush quietly resigned from Silverado's board. 4 months later, in December of 1988, just weeks after his father won the presidency, federal regulators walked in and seized Silverado outright. It was insolvent, one of the largest savings and loan failures in the country, and the bill was about to land on the desks of American taxpayers. The timing turned a regional bank failure into a national scandal. Congress hauled Neil Bush in front of the House Banking Committee, where he sat across from Congressman Joseph Kennedy II, who tore into him on live television while the son of the sitting president squirmed under the lights. Reporters camped outside his house. Editorial cartoonists had a field day for weeks. Some in the administration privately grumbled it was a political pile-on, timed to embarrass the new president. For one strange moment, Neil Bush became the face of the entire nationwide savings and loan crisis. So, what actually happened to him? Federal regulators found that Neil Bush had violated conflict of interest rules by failing to disclose his business ties to the men he was approving loans for. He was formally reprimanded. He was never criminally charged. In the end, he agreed to pay $50,000 to settle the case. A rounding error next to the billion-dollar hole Silverado left behind. His father, watching from the White House, reportedly considered walking away from a second term just to spare his son more pain. Neil Bush wasn't the only name attached to Silverado. The bank's chairman, Michael Wise, stood trial on fraud charges tied to the collapse, accused of misusing bank funds for things like remodeling his own house, and a jury acquitted him. He was banned from the savings and loan industry for life, but otherwise walked away untouched. The only person actually convicted in connection with Silverado's failure was the bank's majority shareholder, James Metz, sentenced to 6 years. He served 6 months. For a billion-dollar collapse, almost nobody paid a real price. By the time the Resolution Trust Corporation finished cleaning up the wreckage, Silverado's collapse had cost taxpayers over $1 billion. Some final accountings put the number closer to $1.3 billion. And Silverado wasn't an isolated case. Between 1986 and 1995, more than 1,000 savings and loans failed across the country, in a crisis that would ultimately cost the American public well over $100 billion combined. Silverado just happened to have a famous last name attached to it. Here's the part almost nobody remembers. A decade later, Michael Wise resurfaced in Aspen, running an investment firm called Cornerstone Private Capital. He still had the polish, impeccably dressed, charming, the kind of guy who made wealthy clients feel like they'd gotten in on something exclusive. He pulled in dozens of investors promising strong returns on high-interest real estate loans. And once again, the money didn't add up. In 1999, Wise pleaded guilty to stealing $8.7 million from those same investors. He served 3.5 years in federal prison. A decade after that, in 2009, he died by suicide. The man at the center of Colorado's biggest banking scandal never really stopped running the same playbook. He just found a new zip code to run it in. Silverado never became a household name like Enron or Madoff. But it might be one of the purest examples of what the savings and loan crisis actually was: connections doing the work regulation should have, and consequences landing everywhere except where the real power sat. A 30-year-old with zero banking experience helped sink a billion-dollar institution and walked away with a $50,000 bill. The men actually running the place mostly walked away too. Until, for one of them, the bill finally came due, just in a different city, a decade later.